So, as you can see by now, the decade of the 1960s has been incredibly tumultuous. Um, Presidential assassinations, civil rights movements and activations, Great Society programs, all while that is going on. That's really almost surface level type stuff as far as the true depth of the decade of the 1960s. Because despite all those things that I just mentioned and have talked about in prior slides, you still have the Cold War. Oh, yeah. The Soviet Union, communism. Oh, yeah. We had talked about McCarthyism and the fear of expansion of communism, not only across the world, but in the United States and in American government itself. Okay. Um, President Kennedy was a staunch anti communist. He had a severe disdain for communism, as did and still do most Americans. Okay? LBJ wanted to continue upon those beliefs as well. So, all the while, we are trying to improve our society's ills. We're trying to reduce poverty. We're trying to make things more equal for certain segments of our population. We're trying to uh, dig from out of some of those trenches. Stemming from the Eisenhower era, Kennedy had a policy to try and contain communist spread, and he had several different ways of going about it. Part of it was done out of somewhat of a misunderstanding of Soviet intentions in the first place. The anti communist thought at the time was obviously felt around the idea of containing communism and thwarting the Soviet threat from influencing American society and elsewhere around the world. In reality, over the decades, we've uncovered, and various different documents have verified this, the Soviet Union wasn't as much trying to abjectly expand communism as much as they were trying to protect themselves. See, the Soviet Union had been invaded at least by the Germans twice. Napoleon had gone into Russia. Russia has been a staging ground for various different wars. And ever since their communist revolutionary days, they've been very protective. And so it's not as much that they were trying to expand communism, it was at least as much a philosophy of self protectionism. That's really what a lot of it is. And if you expand your influence, you make more allies, you're going to be able to protect yourself better. Okay, so over the decades, we have understood that a little bit better. Doesn't mean it's the right approach, and it certainly doesn't mean that communism is good. It's just maybe it sheds a little bit different of a light. But in the early 1960s, extending from the Eisenhower 50s, we began a policy of not just containing communism, but we set in forth the motion for there to be various other projects and various other foreign policies that would now deliver on the actions of maybe reducing communist influence throughout the world. So, from that perspective, the Kennedy administration, in an effort to contain communism, started to be flexible in the way that a nuclear weapons oriented military would be a defense strategy. Um, he wasn't really satisfied with the way that the U.S. could deal with Soviet threats across the world, or at least perceived threats. Especially in third world countries. More developed nations were less susceptible to communist ideology. Your third world nations, particularly those who have been colonized by Europeans, imperialized, marginalized. A lot of your common Marxist and communist verbiage comes from this era of imperialism. You were marginalized, you were colonized, you were exploited. Words like that are at the epicenter of Marxist ideology. And there are a lot of people in those countries who, for obvious reasons, are bitter and angry at how even a small country that may be colonized could perhaps be colonized, marginalized, and exploited by a European power. It's a bitter resentment towards that. So, third world countries were believed to be to where the real struggle against communism would go. So, as a direct military effort, the Kennedy administration actually put forth an expansion of special forces within the U.S. military, particularly the Green Berets in the United States Army. That organization was developed specifically to train and fight against guerrilla warfare. They are trained to not just fight, but also deal with guerrilla conflicts and be able to have influence in somewhat more of a limited war. Okay? We're about to have one, so hold that thought. Otherwise, though, the Green Berets and other special units within all of our armed forces have some of their roots in the Kennedy era. And it's for that reason of perhaps a communist containment in an otherwise guerrilla type warfare situation in a third world country. Um, just because we developed the special forces, specifically the Green Berets, didn't mean that we were going to expand our influence militarily. During the Kennedy administration, the Peace Corps was developed. And the Peace Corps' influence had an aim to send young Americans abroad and do work and volunteer in developing nations, i.e., some of the ones who were most vulnerable to prospective communist influence. Okay? So, your good acts of doing greater for the greater good of global society has a benefit of also perhaps containing communism. It's kind of a win-win there. Okay? So, the Peace Corps would nurture a bit of a sense of goodwill towards the United States in otherwise vulnerable areas across the world. And at the same time, it was somewhat counter some of the communist movements across the developing world, and you would perhaps maybe deprive the Soviet Union of a new potential ally. So all throughout Africa and other places across the world, the Peace Corps sent young Americans and various different representatives to establish goodwill relations through acts of service and volunteerism, in a sense, a broader strategy to contain communism. Pretty smart. Okay. Otherwise, though, the Kennedy administration is somewhat. If there were some scars and otherwise ugly marks against the Kennedy administration, you invariably have to start with the Bay of Pigs invasion. So, Bay of Pigs was an event that took place as a result of the Cuban Communist Revolution. So in the 1950s, the Bautista government in Cuba had been very authoritarian and dictative. However, they were staunchly anti-communist and pro-American. You're not really crazy about this guy. You may not really like what he does to his people, but at least it's better than being communist. Well, over the tenure of the Bautista regime, he built up quite a lot of resentment among a number of Cubans. And one of those Cubans who had arbitrary feelings about that was Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro would gain influence in Cuba, become exiled, develop friends of like-minded nature elsewhere in Latin America, and long story short, he would develop a revolutionary force that would eventually re-land in Cuba and sack the Bautista government, thereby establishing a Marxist regime in Cuba. And not only would he establish a Marxist regime, but he was very, very leery of the United States, as Bautista and the United States had great relations. He saw the United States as being a threat to the Cuban Revolution, and he actually feared that the United States might send troops and invade Cuba so as to oust him. And hold that thought. Um, Fidel Castro, a Marxist, he might be otherwise quite friendly to a Soviet mindset. Oh, okay. Um, by 1959 is when the Cuban Revolution took place. By within the span of the next couple of years, roughly about 2,000 Cuban exiles, holdovers from the Bautista regime, and anti-Castro, were trained by American operatives working with the CIA elsewhere in Latin America. They wanted to train roughly about 2,000 former Cuban exiles to perhaps um, have a spontaneous military exploit that could lead to a popular uprising against the Cuban communist regime, the Castro regime. By this time, also, a lot of people had left Cuba and made their way to the United States. Otherwise, though, in April of 1961, this 2,000 person invasion force landed on the southwestern side of Cuba in an area we know as the Bay of Pigs. And things immediately went south. Some planes landed in the wrong place. Some paratroopers landed in the wrong place. Some other supplies that were supposed to be at the beach where some of them landed didn't make it there. And not only that, the Castro regime gained intel of when and where and what was going to happen. So they kind of knew it was going to happen. And what they saw was highly disorganized. And they were able to beat it back and kill, 100 or so of them and capture the rest of them. And therefore imprison them. Easy. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a CIA-backed, therefore a Kennedy administration-backed attempt to remove Fidel Castro from office. And it was a loud and vocal failure. And it was a great stain on the Kennedy administration's platform, and it embarrassed the United States. Okay? And it further entrenched the idea that Cuba should be anti-US and further emboldened Cuban relations with the Soviets. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an unmitigated disaster. Okay? As for the Soviet Union itself, the United States and the Soviet Union had a very frosty and precarious relationship. We were not at war physically with one another, but obviously we're ideologically at odds. So, from that standpoint, one of the things that was a bitter resentment for the Soviets was Berlin itself. You see, Berlin, where it currently is right smack in the middle of what would be East Germany, the Soviet-sponsored East Germany. Berlin itself, though, was still split into two different sides, East Berlin and West Berlin. And even though West Berlin was in East Germany, as it had been controlled by the British, French, and U.S. forces after World War II, was still democratic. West Berlin was still free. So the Soviets really did not like how a lot of East Germans would be able to easily cross over from East Berlin into West Berlin, therefore gaining their freedom. See, one thing we know about communism is that in order for communism to have a shred of an opportunity to work, There has to be 100% buy-in. There cannot be any dissent. We know from the 1930s that Stalin purged however many million Russians because they did not capitulate to the red need. Okay, so what do you do when somebody doesn't buy in? You disappear them. Okay, so with communism, you cannot have dissent. People leaving and escaping to a democratic area cannot be tolerated. And not only that, it's a great stain because who wants to live in a communist society when you can't have any sort of freedom? Where at least on the other side, you have a shred of opportunity without government agents watching your every move. So, from that standpoint, Khrushchev had bitter resentment towards what was going on in East Germany. And he sponsored the idea of there being a physical barrier built between East and West Berlin along the dividing line. Okay? The Berlin Wall is erected in the early 1960s as a result of Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, influencing the East German government to build a barrier to keep people from leaving your country. One of the things I've heard in recent years, and I have very mixed emotions about, is the wall that Donald Trump has proposed to build between the United States and Mexico. I may or may not agree with our actual building of the wall. But one of the things I recognize is that it's a barrier to at least keep people from coming in who shouldn't be here. Okay? If they want to come here, they need to go to an official port of entry and declare asylum. That is the legal and technical way to escape. So if you're crossing at a random border point, you're technically doing something illegal. So the wall would be built in an attempt to keep people from crossing over illegally. You're trying to keep people out who technically shouldn't be here. The Berlin Wall was created to keep people from leaving. You cannot leave. You do not like your situation? Too bad. You cannot leave. That to me is a massive difference. And I've seen people say, oh, Trump's wall is like the Berlin Wall. No, it's not. It's actually the opposite. The Berlin Wall was built to keep people from leaving. You cannot leave your situation. People literally die trying to get to the United States. Okay? Perhaps we ought to do more to make things more fair for them. Otherwise, though, there's a drastic difference. Khrushchev wanted to build a wall to keep people out. That's a massive difference.